Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world. Thank you for joining us at the West.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today. We are here to hear from Sybil Steinberg about all the fabulous books that are coming our way or have already been published and we should all be reading. So without further ado, Sybil, tell us what we should be reading.
First of all, thank you all for coming. This is sort of second home for me, and I love it. And I love to look out at my friends and fellow readers. It's always a pleasure. So I'm going to start with the good news. I made a vow to myself that I would keep the list under 40 today. Yes, and I have. It's only 34, and I was able to include the new Elizabeth Strout and Ian McEwan and Maggie O'Farrell and all of those. Now the bad news. These are the books I haven't read yet. The new Jane Smiley, the new Elizabeth McCracken, Orhan Pamuk, Barbara Kingsolver, Cormac McCarthy has 2 books coming, Percival Everett, John Banville, Kate Atkinson, the George Saunders collection, Catherine Dunn, who wrote Geek Love, The Whalebone Theater, The Rabbit Hutch, and the books of Jacob by the Nobel winner Olga Tarshuk, the 1,900-page tome that I promised you last time I would read. I haven't gotten to it yet. So we'll just go with what I've read. I'm going to speak fairly slowly so that I don't trip over my own tongue. And if you have to leave while I'm still droning on, don't worry, I won't know who you are. Especially if you're wearing a mask. No, really. The first book, the book I think I loved most in this season, is the new Ian McEwan, The Lesson. Sexual abuse by an older woman when he's a boy at a British boarding school results in a man's blighted life, which is finally redeemed by family love. Roland Baines is 11 when he begins piano lessons with Miriam Connell, a beautiful woman who recognizes his exceptional talent at the piano, but damages his future emotional equilibrium by seducing him when he is 14. When, in emotional and moral pain, he ends their relationship and abruptly leaves school and his promising future, he's burdened with a terrible misapprehension. He naively thinks that he was the one who is morally culpable. He's just a kid. That's what he thinks. Only later does he realize that it was Miriam's behavior that was depraved. His wife, Alyssa, tells him that, quote, "This piano teacher rewired your brain," and it's true. After many dead-end jobs, Roland tries to make a living as a poet with little success. And that old psychological damage gets dredged up again when Alyssa abruptly leaves Roland and their baby son to fulfill her own ambitions as a novelist. This freedom to achieve creative fruition is something Roland has never been able to do. And the disparity is even more pronounced when Alyssa's novels are hailed as masterpieces. McEwan follows the span of Roland's life with acute psychological understanding. Simultaneously, and that's what makes this book so good, he etches in the major historical events of the 20th century. Roland observes the momentous changes in the world from the point of view of a man who expects the worst. And really, as you think about it, 20th century had some really terrible things. And that way, his life parallels those of his readers, us. And I found this retrospective view of the 20th century fascinating. At more than 400 leisurely pages, this is the longest novel McEwan has written. But don't read it expecting that it has the drama of atonement, for instance. The novel is subtle and suggesting how easy it is to drift through an unchosen life. It's tremendously affecting. Lucy by the Sea by Elizabeth Strout. This novel is a sequel to O. William, which is shortlisted for the Booker, but it can be read independently, of course. Lucy Barton's former husband, William, insists that she must leave New York as the coronavirus is beginning to escalate. William has rented a house in Maine from Bob Burgess, and if you've read Strauss, he's a character from the Burgess Boys. And again, a character here. Initially unwilling to believe the danger that the virus poses, Lucy is cranky and annoyed at being away from New York and from hers and William's 2 daughters. She becomes besieged by worries about them and by memories of her beloved second husband, David, who was a cellist with the Philharmonic and who has recently died. She descends into the doldrums and finds she cannot write. She thus has free time to take long walks and drives with William, during which she comes to understand the roots of his loneliness and the many sad memories of their marriage. Meanwhile, they make new friends in town, the town in which they and Olive Kittredge, she's in here too, live. Against all odds, given their painful past marriage, gradually Lucy and William forge a new healing relationship. This novel is very much of the moment. In addition to the shadows that the pandemic shed over everything, there are other shadows of the 2016 election. Strout is pretty strong about that, clearly alluded to, and the political differences over getting or not getting the vaccine. Family complications threaten to destroy Lucy's peace of mind, but she achieves an emotional balance and a fresh understanding of her life. This novel is utterly and beautifully honest and insightful about an older woman's interior life. I read it in 2 settings, couldn't put it down. And so I looked up a little more about Strout herself. She grew up in Maine. Her mother's family arrived here in 1603. Her father's ancestors came later in the 1700s. The family was poor. There was no TV and they took no newspapers, but they did have a subscription to the New Yorker. Strout went to law school, but practiced only for a short time. She has said that law school taught her to write tightly and to discard excess emotion. Yet, she arouses emotion in the reader. That emotion, for me, is gratitude that she keeps writing novels. Our Missing Hearts, I'm not sure how to pronounce Celeste's last name. It's Celeste Niege, I think. She's the author of Little Fires Everywhere. She convincingly portrays a dystopian world of the near future. I'm sorry to tell you that several of these books are dystopian. I just couldn't, that's all that's being written now. The near future, but not so bizarre as to suggest science fiction, close enough to seem plausible. In a political and social climate of right-wing fear, a rising number of Asian American children are being forcibly separated from their families that are deemed too liberal. There's a new law under which children whose skin is not white face the threat of being kidnapped by the government. In this society where neighbors spy on each other and people with Asian features are frequently attacked, a 12-year-old mixed-race Bird Gardner lives with his father, a white former Harvard language professor who has taken a menial job shelving books in the library so as to keep a low profile. Bird's mother is a Chinese-American poet who vanished 3 years earlier after she was accused of being subversive because of a poem she had written called All Our Missing Hearts. Bird doesn't understand that she left the family to keep him safe. He only knows that she's gone. Out of the blue, Bird receives a mysterious drawing reminding him of a fairy tale his mother used to tell him. Bird figures out that his mother's in New York City, and he runs away to find her. His adventures in the city closely mirror, pretty much parallel, the plot, the ordeals of the boy in the fairy tales that his mother used to tell him. The plot of the hero who must complete difficult tasks before he is rewarded with the object of his search. And the narrative is especially effective when it offers testimony to the power of art and storytelling to bring comfort to the oppressed. Ensuing events involve a network of librarians who secretly collect information about children torn from their parents. The novel then achieves the tension of a thriller, and it sizzles all the way to the end. The Latecomer is one of my absolute favorite books of this season. I must have recommended it half a dozen times already. Do you remember Tolstoy's observation about unhappy families? Well, this one is idyllic. This novel is a sophisticated and keenly observed view of a singularly dysfunctional family. It's also a complex portrait of lives that contain both privilege and trauma. It's set mainly in two places: a perfectly rendered apartment in upscale Brooklyn, and later at Cornell University in the 1970s. The Oppenheimer triplets, 2 boys and a girl, are born after in vitro conception to Joanna Oppenheimer, whose yearning to be a mother after 3 childless years of marriage has convinced her emotionally detached husband, Salo, to agree to the IVF. Theirs is not a passionate marriage, but it seemed like salvation to Salo, who is trying to forget a tragedy he accidentally caused in his past that has rendered him emotionally guarded ever since. The triplets, products of this needy mother and detached father, actively dislike, even hate each other from childhood on. All 3 are desperate to escape the confines of family, and especially each other. Meanwhile, their father has secretly begun collecting contemporary art, which he keeps in a warehouse in Brooklyn and never reveals to his family. Ironically, he finally falls in love with someone from his past. When the triplets leave for college, a crucial conversation convinces Joanna to have another child, the latecomer of the title. Secrets accrue until a disastrous birthday party on Martha's Vineyard unleashes decades of hidden animosities. The author excels at keeping tension high as the novel examines the causes of grief and guilt, traditions and religion, and family dynamics. It's an absorbing story with expertly woven storylines and plot twists. Properties of Thirst by Marianne Wiggins. It's not really germane to this novel, but you might be interested to know that Marianne Wiggins was the second wife of Salman Rushdie. She's American. They married when she was living in England. There's a lot of history there. She's also a terrific writer. This is a family story, a love story, and it's rich and meaningful historical fiction set during the 1940s. The main character, Rocky Rhodes, is a fiercely independent and morally upright man. He's deeply in love with the western landscape in which he has located his California ranch. He's an impassioned preservationist who's been engaged in a battle with the nefarious Los Angeles Water Company, which, shades of the movie Chinatown, has diverted the water from the mountains to the city and left the Rhodes Ranch dangerously parched. Rocky has other concerns. After his beloved wife died young, he has raised their twins, Stryker and Sonny. The son, Stryker, has become a rebellious daredevil of a teenager. He enlists in the Navy as World War II looms. This is the 1940s. Sonny has inherited her late mother's culinary skill and is the chef of a gourmet restaurant. The crisis in their lives comes when the United States Department of the Interior establishes an internment camp for Japanese Americans on the edge of the Rhodes property. If you haven't read Marianne Wiggins before, I urge you to discover her. She's a magnificent wordsmith. She evokes both interior and exterior landscapes in evocative language, and she conjures scenes with almost cinematic verity. What makes this novel even more remarkable is that she suffered a massive stroke in 2016 as she was finishing the novel, the final chapters. It took several years until she was able to finish the novel in a crescendo of imaginative creativity. It's a memorable achievement. Fellowship Point, another just good old-fashioned novel in the best sense of the term, and it's not dystopian ever. This is a story of a lifelong friendship between two aging women. It's witty, complex, and the sophisticated plot touches on issues of money, class, marriage, aging, land ownership, and ecological ethics, and the hidden secrets of women's lives. It's rich with social and psychological insights. The multi-layered narrative spans decades and generations with a memorable cast of characters. Agnes Lee is a celebrated author of children's books. She's also the author of best-selling adult novels, a satirical series she writes under a pseudonym about well-heeled Philadelphia socialites. She can't reveal her identity as an author of those books, even though they sell like hotcakes, because she would be pilloried by her social equals who would recognize themselves in her characters. Agnes has never married. Her Quaker roots and those of her best friend, Polly Wister, extend to a special place, their family's beloved vacation community on the Maine coast called Fellowship Point. That land is now threatened by developers, and Agnes wants to protect it by donating it to an ecological trust. But to do so, she must persuade the other members of the ownership partnership, including Polly and her children, to dissolve the lines of inheritance. This central issue of the plot is reflected through the deep intimacy and yet unexpressed tensions between Agnes and Polly. When a young editor presses Agnes to write a memoir, not realizing, of course, that Agnes has been leading a double life, many secrets come to light. The author has said it took her 10 years to write the novel because she has so many major subplots and had to carefully entwine them. She's done this with great skill and has provided a surprising yet realistic ending. Learning to Talk by Hilary Mantel. The saddest thing about this short book is that it's the last we'll have of Mantel's brilliant writing. She was writing another book, apparently not to the point where it can be finished by someone else. So in the preface, she explains that these 7 autobiographical short stories illuminate the transforming moments of her haunted childhood. They begin in the 1940s when the narrator, there are differently named narrators in each of the stories, but they're all the same person, is raised in a poor and bitterly cold mill town in northern England. In addition to the meager food and winter chilblains, the young girl in each of these stories is always aware of and ashamed of the gossip that is scorching her family. The narrator's mother has taken a lodger as her lover and has consigned the narrator's father to his own small bedroom. The child in each story realizes that the only way to survive is get up, get on, and get out. Throughout these stories, Mantel's writing is almost poetic. It's just beautiful. Afterlife is by last year's Nobel Prize winner. I just can't seem to catch up with them, but I got caught up with this one. It's a powerful novel that evokes the tragic years of German colonial control of East Africa. He portrays the lives of ordinary people caught up in historical forces beyond their control. It's a multi-generational story, epic in scope, and full of both heartbreaking personal tragedy and the spirit of hope that allows people to endure. Starting in the 1800s, the continent of Africa was carved up by, and I love this sentence, so Coney, was carved up by the Germans and the British and the French and the Belgians and the Portuguese and the Italians. This narrative reveals a constant cycle of suffering, rebellion, and suppression. Many of the native men were either drafted into the invading armies or chose to enlist in hope of a better future. Two of the characters in this novel do just that. One, Ilyas, enlists, leaving his younger sister, Afia, in the custody of friends, and he is not heard from again until the end of the book. Another young man, Hamza, is drafted, and he soon learns to his bitter dismay that the German officers under which he is serving are brutal and racist. His experiences during battles and after being gravely wounded by a sadistic officer form the center of this story. His love for Afia adds a rich dimension, allowing their personal story to achieve resonance as a universal experience. Gurna has written previous novels, which I hadn't read, but he has said that in all of them, he always wants to write about people who are displaced and rendered invisible. So he has created this colonial world with masterful skill. The author of this next novel, obviously her name gives away a lot. No Violet. This is a fierce woman. And Bulawayo, of course, is the capital of Zimbabwe. So this novel is on the short list for the Booker. I think it has a good chance to win. It's a stunning satire that was inspired by the fall of the dictator Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Bulawayo has invented a fictional African country to tell her tale. While all the characters are animals, every single one of them, this is no replay of Animal Farm. It's far more playful, witty, and angry, brutally honest about the ways that corrupt regimes destroy the lives of their subjects. Jadada, this is the name of the country, a former colony, had gained its independence during the Liberation War and has since been ruled by the ruthless father of the nation, a horse who has maintained his 40-year reign through rigged elections and the persecution of dissidents. When he is ousted and succeeded by Vice President Tuvi Delight Shaha, I told you this book is funny as well as tough, another old horse, many Jadadians become hopeful, believing that the latest revolution will bring prosperity to their nation. But when an increasingly totalitarian Tuvi begins to misuse the country's wealth and to implement corrupt policies to safeguard his power, Geraldines begin to realize that they must create a true rebellion. Destiny, a young goat who bears both the physical and psychological scars of her traumatized country, courageously speaks out in public, and although her end is tragic, she is the catalyst for change. In the last chapters, Bulawayo calls for Africa's true liberation from neo-colonial oppression and a reckoning in all the countries where tyrants rule. So this is a truly relevant cry of rebellion that obviously can pertain to many countries around the globe. Trust by Hernan Diaz, his first novel, In the Distance, was a finalist for the Pulitzer, and this is even better. The main thing to know about this novel is that the title has double meaning. The reader cannot trust anything that seems real until it all comes together at the end of the book. It's a clever, continually surprising narrative, a tour de force of shifting perspectives that all reveal the life of the same man, a financial tycoon. Each of the 4 sections concerns that very same rich man whose mediocre rise among the old money moguls during the Gilded Age, the early 1900s, made him a figure of mystery and a multi-millionaire. The first section of the book is what seems to be, as you're reading it, a manuscript of a novel. It's titled Bonds, again, a suggestive name meaning both financial documents and family attachments. This section emphasizes the hero's wizardry, starting as a young man when he makes his first brilliant decisions. The second section seems to be notes for a memoir by the tycoon himself. The narrator of the next section is a Brooklyn-born Italian-American novelist who's looking back on the years that she spent working as a secretary and ghostwriter for a millionaire called Andrew Bevell. So we finally know his name. Obviously, the model for the fictional character in the first and second sections. The last section turns everything upside down. It concerns the early death of the tycoon's wife. Ellen Brevoort came from a blue-blood American family which had lost all its money, but she was educated and introduced socially in Europe, where her precocious memory and brilliant brain made her eligible for marriage to the tycoon. Now, belatedly and astonishingly, she becomes the real fulcrum of this novel. Diaz's rich and supple prose renders this novel a pleasure to read. The theme he develops so brilliantly of the trust that society puts in the manipulation of money, of the betrayals that money and power inflict on society and on vulnerable human beings is really meaningful. Maggie O'Farrell's new novel. I have loved everything that O'Farrell has written. Every book is different from the one before. Of course, I loved Hamnet, but other different books and her nonfiction. Her books are always surprising. This novel left me somewhat underwhelmed, however. Poet Robert Browning's poem, My Last Duchess, which we all learned in grammar school, has been taken to refer to a real woman, Lucrezia de Medici d'Este, the daughter of the Grand Duke Cosimo de Medici, ruler of Florence during the 1550s. Married in 1558 at the age of 15 to Duke Alfonso II of Ferrara, Lucrezia is fictionalized here as a headstrong young woman who realizes that her domineering and brutal husband has decided to murder her because after a year of marriage, she has not engendered a pregnancy, and Alfonso desperately needs an heir to secure his kingdom. O'Farrell's portrait of Lucrezia is rich and fully dimensional. She's evoked as a spirited and intelligent young woman. She's also a talented artist. who is drawn to the handsome young man who's the assistant to the artist who is painting her portrait, the very portrait of Browning's poem. This young man gives her surreptitious signals, I write better than I talk, which become clear as the plot develops. The best things about this novel are the description of court life in the 16th century. Her prose is lush and sumptuous. She includes fascinating details about the rituals that defined and circumscribed daily life in the 16th century. Lucretia's gradual realization of her husband's plan allows O'Farrell to create an alternate ending. This is the aspect of the novel that I found stretch credulity. Maybe I just wasn't prepared for a happy ending, but O'Farrell provides one. A new Ann Tyler. She conjures a family that has drifted into emotional silence by parents whose communication skills are non-existent, and by the wife and mother's desire to achieve her artistic needs and independence. As she has in all of her past books, Tyler superbly captures the minutiae of middle-class life in Baltimore. In a style distinctively her own, she does not need or depend on a dramatic event or a late epiphany to move the plot. She merely describes the everyday domesticity of Mercy and Robin Garrett's quietly happy but only superficially intimate lives. Their 3 children have inherited the facade of happiness while concealing their own deeply felt needs and lack of connection. This family communicates in cliches, never really revealing their true feelings. So, when Mercy finds an artist studio and gradually moves in there, no one ever acknowledges that she has left the family home. She comes back for meals and so forth, but basically she is finding herself elsewhere. Meanwhile, her husband, steadfast, reliable, and emotionally obtuse Robin, sustains the charade of their happy marriage. The siblings undergo their own dysfunctional lack of connection, though, of course, nowhere near as sad as the triplets in the Latecomer. But 6 decades pass, and the ensuing generations do create meaningful relationships that result in a new, emotionally responsive Garrett family. This is very satisfying. Ann Tyler's plots may seem simple and devoid of drama, but her deeply felt understanding of human behavior and of the ways that love and loss affect every life give them a quiet warmth. Geraldine Brooks, another one of my favorite writers, this book, Horse, because horse racing forms the backdrop to this meticulously researched historical novel. The author has said that it was only after she began to write about the famous legendary horse named Lexington that she realized that the issue of slavery and racism in horse racing were inescapable together. Historically, there were significant ways that prestigious, rich, white horse owners were dependent on the plundered labor of Black trainers. One strand of the plot takes place in Kentucky in the 1850s, when Lexington was at the top of his fame, having captured all the prizes for speed and beauty. He was a horse so fast that the stopwatch was manufactured so that his fans could clock his time in races. He was so handsome that the best equestrian artist of the time, a real man named Thomas Scott, was hired to paint him. All this is historically accurate. Lexington owed a good measure of his health, racing prowess, and life to a young Black groom whose name was never acknowledged. So Geraldine Brooks invents a character whom she calls Jarrett. Jarrett is a gifted trainer who forgoes an opportunity to be set free, to earn his freedom, because his bond with the beautiful stallion is the center of his life. But Lexington and Jarrett are sold together. You know, they're both owned and sent south from Kentucky to a massive horse racing operation in Virginia, owned by a ruthless man who exploits the love between Jarrett and Lexington. This historical narrative alternates with a contemporary story that also features a Black man who becomes fascinated with the history of Lexington and his trainer. Theo, the son of Black diplomats, discovers the old painting of Lexington and is writing his doctoral thesis on the disparity between the horse's celebrity and the enslaved condition of his trainer. A love story develops between Theo and a young Australian osteologist who is a scholar of bones, specifically Lexington's skeleton, which she discovers in storage in the Smithsonian. It is apparently there. The attempt to meld these two stories is interesting, not quite up to Geraldine Brooks' usual excellence, but the story is definitely worth reading. Now, here is a book I absolutely adored, and it hasn't had the publicity it deserves. It's called Mercury Pictures Presents. It's by Anthony Marra. I have loved Anthony Marra ever since I read his brilliant novel, A Constellation of Vital Phenomena. If you haven't read it, I know the library must have copies. It's wonderful. And this one confirms his talent. And it's possible not to enjoy this novel, but it's almost impossible to describe. I will do my best. It's a part comedy set in Hollywood in 1940s, and part a dark evocation of the horrors of World War II. This narrative is enlivened by the author's irresistible wit and by his skill in placing characters in heartbreaking situations. Mercury Studios is teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Artie Feldman, the many toupeed head of the studio. Now, he has many toupees all lined up behind his desk because he thinks each one carries the vibrancy of the donor of the hair. I told you this is a funny book. And at any rate, he's struggling to keep his company from financial ruin. And he's called before a Senate committee that questions his patriotism because he hasn't filmed any war propaganda movies. So his principal defender before Congress and the central character of this complicated novel is his associate producer, a young Italian-American woman named Maria Lagana. Maria has recently escaped to the United States from Italy, where her father has been arrested by the fascist regime. As a teenager, Maria inadvertently betrayed her father to the authorities, and she will forever carry that guilt. Now he's in political exile in a small Italian village, and he, her father, becomes embroiled in a convoluted murder plot that will affect characters in America. Meanwhile, back in Hollywood, Artie plans a propaganda movie that will fire up American patriotism. One of the difficulties of making a movie in wartime, however, is trying to shoot footage of battle scenes that will look convincing. So Artie gets the army to build a precise replica of a Berlin neighborhood in the Utah desert. That's where our bombers can and will cause a real firestorm that can be photographed. This development engages another contingent of characters, some of whom are emigres who escaped from Germany, but who are now under suspicion as possible enemy agents. And now the government classifies Maria as an enemy alien, and her lover, a Chinese-American actor, is mistaken for being Japanese, and his future is in doubt. So I'm struggling here to describe the alternate plots and the additional subplots, which I haven't even gone into, which make this almost an espionage thriller and an historical document of Hollywood. Mara's satirical wit illuminates hypocrisy on many levels, and he also writes deeply moving scenes of kindness, compassion, and love among his many characters. Les is lost. Arthur Les, the self-styled, I love this, what he calls himself, minor American novelist, is back from Greer's Pulitzer Prize-winning previous novel, which I hope you've read, called Les. And he's back in this charmer of a novel. Again, the narrator is Freddie Pellew, the lover with whom Les reunited at the end of the previous novel. They're happily living together in San Francisco when Les is dismayed to discover that he's suddenly responsible for 10 years back rent on the little house that his former lover, now deceased, loaned him. Determined to raise the money to avoid eviction, Les signs up for a series of writing assignments that will take him everywhere. One is to do a profile of a weird science fiction author who gulls Les into driving him and his pug dog in a van named, of course, Rosina, from San Francisco to Santa Fe for an on-stage interview. This is kind of thing that kind of scares anybody who does an on-stage interview with an author. This appearance is a disaster, the first of many misadventures. Meanwhile, Freddie is on a sabbatical in Maine, and Les worries that Freddie has decided to leave him. Although the tone is brilliantly funny and joyous, and the plot is breezily inventive, there's a poignant undercurrent that deals with Les's personal demons, his fears and frustrations, and that gives the narrative depth and resonance beyond being just a funny story. Booth, by Karen Joy Fowler, is about the family of John Wilkes Booth, the actor who assassinated Abraham Lincoln. But he's only one of the minor characters in this fully imagined novel that dramatizes the history of this famous theatrical family. Fowler adroitly reveals the highly combustible dysfunction that ruled the family of Junius Brutus Booth. He was a celebrated Shakespearean actor, and he was charged with bigamy in England in 1821 and fled to America with his mistress, later wife, who had sold flowers in Drury Lane, shades of My Fair Lady. Here, Junius Booth sired 10 children, 4 of whom died in childhood. The survivors lived in near poverty on a farm in Maryland. The patriarch was a despot whose eccentricities became actually and actively delusion. And 3 of the Booth's surviving children became actors: Julius Jr., Edwin, and the nefarious John Wilkes. He was a Confederate sympathizer, willfully ignorant of the suffering of the family's servants, who were former slaves who were trying to buy their children out of bondage. There were 2 surviving Booth daughters. Rosalie was sacrificed to the raising of the other children and led a sequestered and frustrated life. The other daughter, Asia, collected as much of the family history as exists. It was from these fragments that the author draws upon to produce this colorful and tragic story. Vigil Harbor, it's set in the not-so-distant future. Here we are again, but it's a suspenseful novel. It takes place in a Massachusetts coastal town where residents of the close-knit liberal community are trying to remain secure from the right-wing political turmoil and the environmental devastation that has gripped most of the country. The intersecting lives of 8 characters provide a dramatic narrative art. One young man is suffering severe psychological damage from having been trapped in Manhattan during a recent terrorist bombing. After a stranger insinuates himself into the community, the separate strands of existential fear and grief culminate in a heart-pounding hostage episode. While there may be other novels of higher profile this season, this one is a satisfying read. Now, each of the following 3 novels is challenging, each in its own way. Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. This is a narrative of time travel and paranormal experiences. It's not an easy read, but it's provocative and rewarding. After the prescience she exhibited in her previous novel, Station 11, and by the way, there's an excellent TV adaptation of that book on cable, TV again writes plausibly about the future, unraveling of life as we know it. This is set in 5 different time periods, partly on a strangely altered Earth, and partly on one of our future colonies on the moon. The first section is a flashback to 1912. A young man from England has been exiled from his family and sent to Canada. This utterly normal young man experiences a spooky paranormal vision in the Canadian woods. This scene is echoed in the next section, set in 2020, when a composer shows a video of that same mysterious scene in the forest. In the next section, set in 2203, an author called Olive Llewellyn, who was raised on one of the moon colonies, is on a book tour on Earth to talk about her new novel, which describes a coming pandemic. Olive is desperately missing her husband and small daughter on the moon, and she's unaware that another pandemic, a real pandemic, will soon sweep over the planet and leave her marooned here. The character who ties these sections together, so listen carefully, is a man who is named after one of the characters in one of the fictional Olive's novels. Told you it was, take notes. This character has appeared in each of the 3 preceding sections and time zones. And Mandel explains it all ingeniously. And my description is probably not doing the plot justice. Just know it's complicated and interesting. Either or, this is an engaging novel of ideas, again, for serious readers who enjoy cerebral narratives. It's a sequel to Batuman's brilliant first novel, The Idiot, which introduced Salin, a freshman at Harvard. Readers of that novel had to appreciate the references to Dostoevsky, The Idiot. This one provides insights from Kierkegaard and André Breton. I learned a lot. Here, brainy Salin is a Harvard sophomore, still trying to make sense of human relationships, academic life, sexual compatibility, and what it will take to achieve her ambition of becoming a literary author. Her distinctive comic voice intersperses one-liners and provocative insights, even as she ponders philosophical questions. Meanwhile, she's also trying to reconcile the elements of her Turkish heritage and her American upbringing. And this novel is really worth the close attention it demands. Another sort of different, again, on the spectrum of novels that really require close attention. This one is intriguing and unsettling. It's a novel about an ardent friendship that leads to artistic creation and painful exploitation. Agnès and Fabienne are inseparable teenage girls who live in poverty in post-World War II in France. Fabienne's father is an alcoholic, and Fabienne has had to leave school to care for the family's 2 cows and goats. Agnès' home life is a bit better, but her peasant parents are so careworn, and their grief about their son, who is dying of a war-related illness, is so all-consuming that Agnès is barely acknowledged. Fabienne, desperate to escape her life, invents what she calls games, which are really a series of stories about little children who die in various ghastly ways. Agnès records them in a notebook that they recklessly decide to show to the recently widowed village postmaster, Monsieur Deveau. When he helps get the stories published, and they are, Fabienne insists that Agnès take credit as the sole author. She doesn't want to be identified. The book becomes famous, and Agnès is levitated from Saint-Rémy to a boarding school in England, where, lonely and unhappy, she experiences the cruelties of fame and almost, despite herself, grows into a real writer. The author says that she was inspired by an historical phenomenon, which I think we all remember, a rash of precocious authors that occurred in post-war France. Remember teenage François Sagan, who wrote Bonjour Tristesse? Obviously, there were other teenagers during that period who apparently wrote amazing books. So the author has said she whittled down her story from almost 600 pages to a lean, terse 300, producing a vibrating tension that's as much about the process of writing as it is about a claustrophobic relationship. Now, after all of the above, the next quiet story may seem simple, but it's really wonderful. Small things like these. Claire Keegan is an Irish writer who is just beginning to be known in this country. She's had stories published in the New Yorker. This novel is shortlisted for the Booker. She has another novel coming soon. I can't wait. This deeply moving story, told with simplicity and restraint, carries a profound impact beyond its 100 pages. Bill Furlong, a loving husband and father of 5 daughters, lives in a small village in Ireland that is slipping into economic decline. He's always carried the burden of being the illegitimate son of an unmarried woman who had found refuge working in the home of a kind Protestant villager, one of the few people in the village who were not Catholic. Bill, of course, has been raised as Catholic, and he has earned the respect and admiration of his neighbors as a hardworking coal merchant. He's especially beloved for extending credit to families who are suffering from poverty. During the week before Christmas in 1985, while making a coal delivery to the local convent, he is shaken by his discovery of a young girl locked in the freezing coal shed for having some small infraction of convent rules. She begs him to take her to the river so she can drown herself. He can't answer her plea, of course, and when he returns her to the convent, he sees several miserable, undernourished young girls scrubbing floors and doing laundry in despicable living conditions. We have since read about this Magdalene laundries. He feels ashamed for not acknowledging the cruelty of the nuns who bask in affluent circumstances while ruling the villagers with an iron hand. A sudden encounter that reveals the secret of his parentage and his insight into the fate that his own mother had escaped by not being consigned to this convent propels him to make a dramatic move. The strength of Bill's quiet, compassionate decision makes this novel a small masterpiece. Now, this next book is not current. It won the Nobel Prize in 1955 for its vivid, epic power, which has renewed the great narrative art of Iceland. And you know what? I'm not going to tell you about it. It's long, and we are running out of time, out of town as well. And I'll bet you're getting hungry. So I'm going to skip to the nonfiction. I urge you to read Independent People. It's just been reissued, and it's brilliant, and it really is a classic. But I'm going to go to the nonfiction. I like reading memoirs because I'm always fascinated by how people live. And the 7 nonfiction books on this list are all written by celebrities of different fields, all of whom have had interesting lives. Now, I'm going to drink some tea from a thermos, which is sort of provocative for me, because the editor who hired me at Publishers Weekly was famous for bringing vodka in her thermos in the morning and told us it was tea. And there were quite a few interesting days during that time. So I'm drinking tea. Paul Newman, The Extraordinary Life of an Ordinary Man. If you watched the recent documentary on cable and were disappointed, I can say that this book, which is from that documentary, but there's far more information, and it gives a far more fair and nuanced portrait of Paul Newman. It's far from being a Hollywood puff piece. It's extraordinary in itself because Paul Newman, in his own words, has supplied the bulk of this memoir. And also there are thousands of pages of transcripts. But Newman, in his tapes, reveals his vulnerabilities. He talks about his lifelong feeling of inadequacy caused by a traumatic childhood dominated by his exceedingly troubled parents. The book is enlivened by the voices of his childhood friends and Navy buddies, family members, and film and theater collaborators. Newman is sometimes funny, often rueful, and admirably honest. He recounts his insecurities from childhood onward, his first marriage, his passionate relationship with Joanne Woodward, whom he recognized from the very beginning as being more talented than he was, despite his wider stardom and celebrity. And he acknowledges his reliance on her, especially in the years when the pictures he made were mediocre or worse. He talks about his alcoholism with amazing facts about his prodigious drinking. The impetus for bearing his heart and soul was his desire for his daughters to know and understand the truth about their father. Melissa Newman has written the foreword, and her sister Clea has written the afterword. There are 41 photos, and of course you know that Lissy will be speaking about the book at the Playhouse, and your ticket will entitle you to a copy of the book as well. Shy, the alarmingly outspoken memoirs of Mary Rogers, written by Mary Rogers and Jesse Green. The first laugh comes from the title. In assembling this memoir, Mary Rogers was anything but shy. Nearly every bold-faced name in the musical theater, and many from the culture at large, are unforgettably checked in this superbly candid, hilariously quipped, wrenchingly sad memoir by the daughter of Richard Rogers. She died in 2014, and Jesse Green, who is the chief drama critic of the New York Times, has faithfully rendered their recorded conversations, and he supplies a myriad of footnotes to identify identify the people that Mary variously praises or demolishes. Known mainly as her father's daughter and the composer of Once Upon a Mattress, Mary also had a long career as a composer for TV and screen, and as the author of best-selling books for children. She married twice, had 6 children, slept with anyone who counted, and tried to escape the scathing memories of her upbringing by her cold, demanding mother, Dorothy, who invented the Johnny Mop and who wrote about home decoration. Of her mother, Rogers writes, her idea of a daughter was a chambermaid crossed with a lapdog. Mary Rogers also reveals her father's alcoholism, compulsive womanizing, and the depression that at one point had him confined to a psychiatric ward. Most importantly, her detailed recollections of showbiz culture, including gossipy anecdotes and especially astute characterizations of some of the most significant players, including Stephen Sondheim, during Broadway's finest decades, are priceless. Leapt on 10th, oh, speed up. A Second Chance at Life. This is subtitled by Delia Ephron. Like her more famous sister Nora, Delia Ephron is a writer. She collaborated with Nora on the script of You've Got Mail and has written fiction and nonfiction books. This memoir is a journey through some of the most amazing experiences in her life. It begins in loss, as she recounts the death of her beloved husband, who died in their New York apartment on 10th Street in Greenwich Village. He succumbed to cancer, as had Nora just a year previously. Delia was 72, and she was working through her heartbreak when she got an email offering solace from a man she had dated briefly many years previously. More emails ascended to phone conversations and then to meeting in person. Delia and Peter, a California psychotherapist, fell in love and became a couple. But only 4 months later, Delia was diagnosed with the same rare blood cancer that had killed Nora. But treatment for that kind of leukemia had improved, and so when doctors gave her a good chance to survive, Delia signed on for the chemo. It did briefly put her into remission. But when the cancer returned, she agreed to try a new experimental drug, and the treatment turned out to be gruesome, and it is described in brutal detail. But she also describes the amazing devotion that kept Peter by her side. So this memoir is a life-affirming story of recovery and happiness. I don't know whether you read Robert Pinsky, the wonderful poet, former poet laureate. This short memoir is funny and poignant. He relieves his upbringing in Long Branch, New Jersey, a rundown Jersey Shore resort town with a mixed population of Italian, Black, and Jewish families. His journey to a fulfilling career was not traditional, nor was it particularly ordained. Descended from a grandfather who was a bootlegger, a financially stressed optician father, and a sharp-voiced and frustrated mother, Pinsky was a C student in high school, but he was obsessed with the rhythms and melodies of speech. Here he reflects on the words and the relationships that shaped him as a writer. Some of the formative moments that brought him toward poetry were chanting a Haftorah at his synagogue and forming a band in junior high. To his surprise, he found his career path at Rutgers in the early 60s and later at Stanford. His anecdotes are earnest and humble, but it's his musings about the voice of music in poetry that gives his memoir significance. This memoir has the subtitle, A Reckoning of Memory and Murder in the Mississippi Delta. Lowry describes a gruesome murder in 1948 by a 42-year-old socialite named Ruth Dinkins, the murder of her own mother, Idella Thompson. Idella, the mother, was a tempestuous descendant of one of the prominent old Mississippi plantation families, and a woman who was not widely liked. Ruth was found covered in blood near her mother's butchered body. She accused a mysterious black man whom she said she saw running from the house in broad daylight. And of course, there was no such man. Evidence was very strong that Ruth herself had inflicted the more than 150 stab wounds on her mother. Her trial, lifetime conviction, and subsequent incarceration in the notorious Parchment prison tore the town apart and generated an unprecedented high volume of petitions, both for and against her release. The majority of letters from prominent white people resulted in Ruth's release from prison by the governor after only 6 years of her term. And then, after more letters, the governor pardoned her altogether. The author herself grew up in a nearby town. She was 10 years old at the time that Dinkins savagely hacked her mother, and she understands the tense atmosphere surrounding the situation. She interpolates details of her own family's disintegration during these same years, but mainly she provides a perceptively detailed background of class, race, and political relationships in the Jim Crow Deep South. Familia Grande, this memoir, which has been published here but not widely read, I think, created a scandal in France. The author dared to expose her well-known, highly respected stepfather, the political scientist Olivier Duhamel, as a pedophile who had raped her twin brother when they were young. Her wealthy and powerful family was celebrated as a close-knit, sophisticated member of the French elite intelligentsia. Her mother was an outspoken feminist, her aunt was a beloved actress, and her father had co-founded Doctors Without Borders. But things, of course, were not what they seemed. Camille had a special reason for not disclosing her stepfather's abuse at the time. She didn't want to ruin her mother's enjoyable second marriage to Duhamel. But as the years went by, her guilt about betraying her brother haunted her mind. The situation was complicated by a popular social movement towards sexual liberation. Again, I am quoting, in 1977, an open letter signed by intellectuals, philosophers, and psychoanalysts in support of decriminalizing sexual relationships between adults and children under the age of 16. This was no longer deemed criminal behavior. Camille's stepfather took advantage also of the almost legendary La Familia Grande's celebrated reunions in southern France every summer. Camille first evokes the happiness of her childhood days, the adoration of her mother, her close relationship with her brother, and she slowly darkens the tone to reveal the truth beneath the idyllic memories. After several family suicides, she and her brother realized that they must reveal the truth so that their stepfather could not be able to prey on their own young children. And her anguish comes straight off the page. Pretty amazing book. This Summer Friend by Charles McGrath. I picked this up because I knew him when I was in publishing. He was a deputy editor of The New Yorker and also as the former editor of the New York Times Book Review. So as this memoir, he writes, as a young journalist, husband, and father, Chip McGrath, began a warm friendship with another man called Chip, an architect who lived with his family in the small New England seashore town where the McGraths spent their summers. Their backgrounds could not have been more different. The other Chip was a WASP, the son of a former headmaster of Phillips Exeter and a Vietnam vet. McGrath had grown up in working-class Brighton, Massachusetts. He is Irish Catholic and was a self-described draft dodger during the Vietnam War. In this warm and affecting memoir, McGrath looks back on the simple summer pleasures that the two men shared, avidly sailing, playing golf, bonding through various adventures. Nostalgia haunts these beautifully written chapters as McGrath describes his friend's losing fight with cancer and the privilege of having known him. Now, and I'm going to wrap it up fast, I hope. First, the next few books pertain to some episodes in American history. Who killed Jane Stanford? The mysterious death of Jane Stanford, who with her husband had founded Stanford University in memory of their son, is explored and perhaps solved in this exhaustively researched book. Jane Stanford was a nasty woman who used her great wealth to wield dictatorial power over the president of Stanford and the Board of Trustees. She was a believer in spiritualism, specifically a cult that planned reunions with loved ones in afterlife, and she insisted that the university spread that doctrine. She was poisoned with strychnine twice in a short space of time, and she died after the second poisoning in 1905. Although the cause of death was obvious, the university, the police, and her family colluded and contended that no one had any reason to cause her harm. It was an accident. The how and why of the cover-up is fascinating, as are the descriptions of the famous university's early days. The narrative lays bare the deep divisions of class, race, religion, and gender during the turn of the century in California, and the corruption that existed among lawyers, servants, police, private detectives, academics, and Jane's greedy heirs. For over a century, the university crafted a story that Jane was a selfless benefactor who had died a natural death. The author gives us a full story of the murder for the first time, identifying the person he believes to be the killer. The Sewing Girls, a tale, it's a well-researched social and cultural history. It's an account of a 17-year-old woman's courageous attempt to charge a man with rape. It took place in 1793. Lana Sawyer agreed to take an evening walk with a man who appeared to be a gentleman. However, he dragged her into a brothel and raped her. The rapist, Harry Bedloe, was from an already old and prestigious, wealthy social circle in New York. Lana, who came from a working class, had no idea of his true identity. Now, the law at that time read that if Bedloe, or any man, was convicted of the charge of being a rapist, he would automatically receive a death sentence. So, although Lana's testimony was clear, a jury of Bedloe's peers acquitted him of the crime. He was defended by a dream team of 6 private defense attorneys, one of whom was Alexander Hamilton, who subjected Lana to a humiliating prosecution, suggesting that she was one of those malicious women who brought false accusations against innocent men. An English lawyer, newly arrived in America, decided to take notes at the trial, and his was the first published report of such a trial in the United States. Who knew? Again, Oh Say Can You Hear? This is a very informative and timely study written by a music historian. He explores how the Star-Spangled Banner has helped forge our very sense of being American. He looks at the history of our national anthem from its creation by Francis Scott Key, in itself a dramatic story, to the complex and often contentious intersection of the song as it has been used in very different ways. In politics, sports, war, immigration, and the social justice movement. Scott Key was a contradictory person, both a slaveholder and a lawyer who represented Black people in court. And he explicitly wrote his lyrics to the tune of an already popular song that had been composed in England and widely sung there and was instantly recognizable here. Apparently, this was a common practice because in colonial times it was difficult and expensive to print the notes of songs. So many well-known melodies were used over and over again. So when Scott Key chose that tune that he obviously already knew, he was also obviously not mindful of the difficulty of spanning the octaves when it was sung. This book is stuffed with colorful character sketches, intriguing historical arcana, and memorable musical facts. And the next book is about a song, My Old Kentucky Home, subtitled The Astonishing Life and Reckoning of an Iconic American Song. This account of Stephen Foster's familiar refrain is an eye-opener. He wrote the song in the voice of a Black slave who is being separated from his family and sold down the river, and who dies, if you go to the very end of all the verses, who dies after being whipped to death on a sugarcane plantation. It was inspired by Uncle Tom's Cabin, but Stephen Foster chose to ignore the message of that book, and he described slavery in sentimental terms. The second line of the song, if you remember, reads, "'Tis summer and the darkies are gay." Originally, it was sung by minstrels, white men in blackface, who incorporated it into vaudeville acts. Gradually, over the years, some of the racist lyrics were changed, and eventually, the ladies who wept were those who had lost their husbands, sons, and plantations during the Civil War. The Daughters of the Confederacy whitewashed its meaning and turned it into a mournful ode of the lost cause. It became the nostalgic anthem of Southerners who, with tears in their eyes, rise to sing it at the Kentucky Derby. Emily Bingham herself is a descendant of a family who owned slaves, and she charts the evolution of the song as our nation has maintained racial prejudice well into this century. The next book taught me a lot. It was out last year, it's not current, somebody recommended it to me. It poses salient questions about food and faith and how they intersect. The author wondered why city folks like us spend so much money on organic food, while evangelical farmers are glad to take advantage of genetically modified seeds to raise their crops. She embedded herself with a wheat harvesting crew as it trekked across the Midwest for 5 months, following the wheat as it ripens about 20 miles per day. She learned that these Christian farmers questions about food always lead to the Bible, where they find explanations for their daily and existential life. Some of their ardent beliefs may seem simplistic to those not steeped in biblical thoughts, But Mockett shows respect, even when their deepest spirituality eludes her. Her trip through the wheat belt from Texas to Idaho illuminates the sheer physical rigor of backbreaking daily work and the fervent religious landscape that quelches intellectual questioning and leans toward a right-wing explanation of the world. Mockett was also disquieted by the question of race, the genocidal dispersal of the Indians, some of whom still live in this western area, the almost unvarying sea of white faces everywhere, and her own discomfort as she contemplates the political divisions in our country. In addition to the haunting questions she raises, Mockett writes with lyrical grace, and this is another reason I recommend the book. Her descriptions of the terrain, the weather, the sunsets and the rainbows, the lightning and unwelcome rain during harvest time are often so beautiful that I had to stop and underline sentences so I would remember them. So thank you all for waiting well beyond. I am on to the 11 books that are waiting on my night table at home. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Sybil, on behalf of everybody here and those who did actually leave a little bit early. For those of you watching from home, we do have a downloadable version of Sybil's list that you can access now. For those of you who are here, you can go to the patron services desk and they will help you place holds for any of the books that you would like to read. Also, if you check the back of your pamphlet that has all the lists, we have some book groups coming up, and so hopefully we'll get to see some of you there. Thanks again.
Great.